welcome to our November POGO session. This meeting is being recorded, as Little Robot Voice has just told you. So really excited to hear this session today. Our focus is on supply chain due diligence and public procurement, with the subtitle of Social and Sustainability Issues in Regulation and Practice. So we're going to be looking at a variety of issues around what due diligence regulation means for public buyers. And our session today is co-chaired by Andrea McLean, who is a GoLab Fellow of Practice here in Oxford and also Social Value Advisor to the Northern Ireland Strategic Investment Board. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrea, who's going to introduce the topic and today's panel.
Thanks, Anne, and welcome everyone. I am delighted to be co-chairing today's session on such an important topic, and thankfully one that is getting more and more attention through public procurement. We have such an impressive panel of experts for us today who are going to talk us through this growth that we're seeing in the regulation of supply chain due diligence and explore what this means for public buyers. As well as looking at the regulatory framework, we're going to be talking through some of the operational challenges around actually getting this into public procurement practice, so such as how to incorporate the voice of central stakeholders, capacity building, potential impacts on SMEs, VCSEs, and also hopefully around, how certain procurement practices may actually exacerbate the issues in terms of human rights abuses and environmental impacts. In the interests of time, I am going to let each panel member introduce themselves. But as we are going through the session, please do get involved. Please feel free to pop any comments or questions in the chat box, as we're going to be collecting these up halfway through and putting them to our panel members. And then also similar to last month's session, I'm delighted that the panel members have kindly agreed to stay on after we formally conclude at 5 p.m. for anyone that would like to continue with the conversation. So I'm going to pass over now to our first speaker, who is Lena from the OECD, who's going to set out what the regulatory context is and talk about a recent pilot that she was involved in. So take it away, Lena.
Thank you. Now I'm unmuted, exactly. I'm going to share some slides just to support what I'm saying, because I realize it is a little bit complex. But yeah, just to say, as per introduction, I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Responsible Business Conduct at the OECD. My main message here today is a little bit to set this scene and explain a little bit the occasion for having a webinar like this, because we see more and more regulation on due diligence coming up. It's taking different forms. And we also see that public buyers will be impacted in some way, but this way will vary depending on the form of regulation. So it remains to be seen how exactly public buyers will be impacted, especially in the day-to-day operations. And in a way, there's also a little bit of a vacuum in addressing this question. And so this is why we're here today, and I hope we can discuss a little bit about this today. I have three parts. First, a few words about due diligence and the emerging regulation in general, then ways in which public procurers might be linked to these regulations, and then how due diligence can work for public buyers in practice. So some insights from the pilot. And the slide is not moving. Okay, here we go. So some of you might know this diagram that you see on the right side of the screen, this 6-step framework that we have at the OECD for risk-based due diligence. And I also put the definition on the screen. What you can see here, that it's really a process. And I want to emphasize that due diligence is a process. And it serves to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts. And here we're talking about actual adverse impacts, so things that have already happened, or potential adverse impacts. We're also talking about the own operations of a company throughout the company's supply chains and business relationships. So that's what due diligence is supposed to do, how we see it at the OECD. Now, let me speak about the various types of regulation that we're seeing. According to OECD estimates, about 3/4, 75% of OECD countries have or are considering own RBC-related legislation. And we can group them roughly into these 3 types that you see on the screen in the different colors. Before I go into that, just to say that if you see a solid field, that means that the legislation or regulation is already in place. If it's a dotted line, those are countries that are currently considering regulation of this type. The first one in light blue are disclosure laws. So companies are required to provide information about their exposure and activities related to risks in their supply chains. Examples that we have here are the UK or Australia. Both of them have modern slavery acts, and companies have to provide a statement of how they're addressing modern slavery risks in their supply chains. There's also the draft corporate sustainability reporting directive at EU level, which I think will be or just has been adopted, and a few other ones as well. The second one are due diligence conduct requirements. So here it's not about providing information, but rather aiming at the conduct of companies. So the law requires companies to conduct due diligence. Examples here are the French, German, Swiss, and Norwegian laws, and those laws mandate horizontal due diligence. So not just sector specific, that is also something that we see, but those are kind of across the board. And then the European Union draft, the proposal on corporate sustainable due diligence directive, CSDDD, falls also under this category, and you'll hear more from that, more about that from Laura after. Then the last one is about product or trade bans. And here it's about prohibiting the import, sale, putting to market of specific products. So you can't buy, or you're not allowed to buy certain products. This can be seen in a very prominent law, the US Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, for example. But we also have a European Commission proposal that regulates products made by forced labor, and similar draft bills in New Zealand and Canada, actually. Now, as you can see, this is quite a big landscape, and I just want to flag that obviously all of these jurisdictions don't adopt the same approach. They don't adopt the same definition of due diligence. They might not adopt the same approach to how, obviously, I already talked about how they're all tackling a different aspect of responsible business conduct and due diligence, but even within that, they differ, and they also differ with regards to their approaches in the supply chains. And so if you can imagine that maybe this has an effect on public procurement, we have another layer of complexity here. Now let's have a look at what this might mean for public procurement. We have some examples of public procurement being directly mentioned in some of these laws that I introduced previously. For example, on disclosure laws, we see some laws that require a similar kind of disclosure by public institutions or by governments, and public procurement, being the interface with the market and with supply chains, obviously has a very specific role here in creating transparency. An example is Australia, where the government has to also publish a modern slavery statement, and so obviously they have to look into what public procurement does with regards to supply chains as well. In the second category of due diligence conduct requirements, public buyers have to consider the supplier conduct. That can be quite indirect in the sense that the market changes, and so public buyers change what they buy. But it could also be in a much more direct way. For example, in Germany, where public buyers have to exclude bidders that are not complying with the supply chain law, with the due diligence supply chain law that we see in Germany. And then finally, product and trade bans. Here, the link might be very direct and concrete, in that public buyers also have to comply with these laws, and they're not allowed to purchase products that are banned. Now, let's take the flip side. We talked a lot about how public buyers might be affected by regulations and requirements on due diligence, but we can also take the reverse perspective and think about the concept of due diligence and how that might work to enhance public procurement and help public buyers achieve better outcomes. This is a question that we addressed in the OECD pilot on due diligence in public procurement of garment and textiles. That's something that we ran last year. We brought together 25 practitioners from all levels of government, and it was literally around the globe. So we met online and then had to bring together different time zones. We went from Australia to Colombia in the participation, all levels of government, I already mentioned that. And then we also combined practitioners, public buyers that are purchasing in their day-to-day, and policymakers that are setting the framework for these kinds of activities. We focus on garment and textiles simply because that's a very advanced sector and we see a lot of good practices there. Then we try to pick up on these good practices and kind of bring them together. And what we see is that the good practices in terms of due diligence and public procurement often take place on 3 levels that you see on the screen. And it also mirrors a little bit what we have in the 6-step framework that we're talking about, the own operations and the supply chain and so on. First of all, we have the level of the institution and the overall portfolio. So something that is important here, that due diligence is part of the management. So there is somebody who's equipped and capacitated to talk about risk management, due diligence, to conduct these kinds of activities. And that you then look at the, let's say, purchasing profile of the organization to determine whether there are any particularly risky products that this institution buys on a regular basis and what can be done to mitigate that maybe. The second one aims more at the individual procurement procedure. So if there is a decision to purchase a specific product, how can we maybe reduce or mitigate potential and actual harm in the supply chain for that specific product? So for example, very specifically about human uniforms, that we find out how it is produced and what can we do to maybe change our purchasing decision so that we address the harm. And finally, and then I'm coming to the end, due diligence also takes place obviously in the operations of the supplier. And this is something that Peter might be talking more about. I think one thing that is very important here is not just that we're talking about criteria or contract clauses where due diligence requirements are being passed on, similar to what we are seeing in the laws, but also that public buyers find a way to stay in contact and engage the supplier about issues in the supply chain. So it can't just be a question of enforcing a contract, but also thinking about what actually helps us achieve effects here, and how can we bring together also our main goals and as public buyers to provide public services. And so that's the end of my presentation here. Let me take this down just to conclude from these like 3 sides that I talked about. So the emerging due diligence regulation as a whole, then the second part of public buyers being implicated by these questions in a very practical but very diverse way. And then finally, that there's also a role that due diligence can play to enhance public procurers and help public procurers. I think the question that is still very much open is, how far should the effort of public buyers go if we think about all the other principles that public buyers have to adhere to, the goals that strategic public procurement should be achieving? And so I think there is a lot of open space to discuss what does it mean to let's say, translate this emerging attention and increasing attention to responsible business conduct and due diligence to public procurement in a sensible way. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lena. And lots of questions coming through that hopefully we can start to unpack in the discussion later on. Please do use the chat function if you have any comments or any questions that you want us to put to the panel. I am going to hand over now to Laura and Iska from the Sapiens Network, who are going to focus on the recent EU proposal and how it relates to public procurement.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. And well, on behalf of Esgi and myself, we're very pleased to be here and for the invitation and to be part of this very distinguished panel. So following what Lena just said, we are doing, well, Esgi and I, we are doing research on sustainable public procurement. She's specified in contract enforcement, and I am focusing in human rights in public procurement. So following on what Lena just said, I'm going to talk to you about an ongoing research paper that I've worked with Esgi in one of these legal frameworks aiming to impose a human rights due diligence in the EU. The recent proposal from the Commission, it is noteworthy to say that there was a previous proposal by the Parliament. The most recent one is about the Commission, issued by the Commission, and that's the one that we are going to analyze. I'm going to just briefly introduce to you what is this legal framework aiming to do. Then I'll just talk with you about the two limitations that we've identified. And then I'm going to talk about the ways in which we have seen the proposed directive and human rights due diligence can be applied for public buyers in procurement processes, having in mind that we have this human rights due diligence proposal, and on the other hand, we have a public sector directive that also has certain rules and restrictions for the procurement process. So basically, what this proposal aims to do is to include monetary obligations for large corporations within the EU, but also in third country companies to prevent, mitigate, and redress adverse impacts on human rights and the environment, not only in their own operation, but also in their supply chain. So we have both obliged companies that fall into the scope of this proposal and other companies that wouldn't be within the scope, so are not obliged to conduct human rights due diligence. And basically the proposal reflects 7 main tasks that these obliged companies would have to do, which is first, integrate due diligence policies, identify actual and potential adverse impacts, then prevent and mitigate these potential adverse impacts, bring them to an end, establish and maintain complaints procedure, monitor them, and communicate the entire process. So to ensure compliance, and this is a very important aspect for public procurement, to ensure compliance, the proposed directive requires that member states designate supervisory authorities with the power to basically investigate and see whether companies are complying or not. And then when they are not complying, to impose sanctions. And these sanctions are meant to be published or publicly available. And I explain why it is relevant for public buyers. So having set the framework of what is this proposal about, I will tell you about the 2 limitations that we've identified. So the first one is, and it has very widely criticized about the proposal, the exclusion of SMEs. In our analysis, we identified that although they are excluded, SMEs are excluded, they might still be affected by the actions of the human rights due diligence obligations that big companies would have, but it's still to determine where the amount of affectation that they will have. And the second one was the lack of reference. The second limitation is the lack of reference to public procurement. Unlike the previous proposal of the Parliament, this proposal from the Commission did not include any reference to public procurement. So Esgi and I were analyzing this, and despite of the limitation, we were investigating how could, despite the exclusion or not reference to public procurement, how could the proposed directive match with public procurement under the public sector directive that has several limitations and rules and constraints to public procurement? How can we establish a marriage to operationalize these human rights due diligence obligations into what was Lena saying, into the conduct of suppliers. And we've identified 3 ways in which human rights due diligence obligations can be enforced through public procurement. I'm going to go through each one of them. So the first is exclusion grounds, second, selection criteria, and the third is in contract performance conditions. So in the exclusion grounds, when economic operators, when I say economic operators, it's tenderers, businesses, awarded business, mainly businesses that participate in the process. So when economic operators violate social law or commit a grave professional misconduct, they can be excluded from the process. So the proposed directive facilitates the application of these exclusion grounds. Why? Because when companies breach human rights due diligence obligations, as I mentioned before, they are sanctioned, and those sanctions are publicly available. So this means that a public buyer could be able to easily access these sanctions and see whether their tenderers have been complying with human rights due diligence obligations or not. And having an objective evidence, which is this decision from the sanctionary authority, to exclude them. Although the legal challenges to the exclusion grounds is that there is no clarity on whether this proposed directive of human rights due diligence constitutes social law, or whether the violation to its provisions constitute a grave professional misconduct, which could lead to a challenge the exclusion decision in a court by the excluded tenderer. The second way that this proposal directive could be enforced through public procurement is public buyers could enforce the directive by requesting an indication of management systems integrating human rights due diligence obligations from the economic operators as proof of their technical ability to perform the contract, so as one of the selection criteria. For example, human rights due diligence related documents like prevention action plans or contractual assurances from business partners, these deriving from human rights due diligence obligations, could fall into the description of means of proof of selection criteria. And the third one is about contract performance conditions. So these are the ways the contract performance conditions have been identified as the most, let's say, friendly way to include sustainability criteria, because it is less restricted in the public sector directive, the public procurement directive. So the contract performance conditions are the ways in which the awarded business will carry out the contract. So we analyzed and we identified that one or several human rights due diligence tasks set in the proposal directive could be enforced or used as blueprints by public buyers in the contract as a performance condition. Although there are 2 legal challenges to these use. One is the subject matter of the contract, and the other one is engagement or termination of the contract. So regarding subject matter of the contract, this is that human rights due diligence can only be requested on the goods the contracting authority is buying. So for example, if the contract regards a public purchase of 100 uniforms, then the human rights due diligence obligations will need to be restricted to that 100 uniforms rather than to all uniforms or any other products marketed by the supplier that do not regard the contract. So this is a challenge because human rights due diligence it's complex, it's time and resource consuming, as well as a holistic process that involves the entire business model. So it is questionable whether it is possible to conduct it only on a certain product, or even if the contractor will be aiming to do it only on a certain part of their businesses. So basically asking the question, can a supplier deliver coffee to the government free of forced labor or with certain process to diminish the risk of forced labor, but continue selling to other private consumers forced labor coffee? So I think this is one interesting question to address in the table. And then another challenge for the contract performance conditions is the engagement with the private contractor and the rules for the termination of a contract under the public procurement directive. So if the contract includes an obligation, let's say a human rights due diligence obligation, for example, the supplier needs to establish and maintain a complaint procedure. Then whenever the supplier will be executing the contract, if it fails to establish this complaint procedure, then the contract is modified and might be able to modify and might be able to terminate, because this might entail a modification of the contract, which would entail a termination according to the rules of the Public Procurement Directive. So this is just in tension with the entire rationale behind the human rights due diligence, which is engagement with your contractor. You don't want to terminate their relationship with your contractor because that might end to even worsening the conditions in the supply chains, maybe having more worse conditions for workers in supply chain or any other reason. So this is possible, the contract performance condition. It just needs to bear in mind what is the way out. So if the supplier has been established for an obligation to place a complaints procedure and it is not complying with it, then the contract might say what is the way out of this. If the supplier might have a 6-month period of grace to correct this breach of the contract, or any other way out that the contractor might want to draft. So in the last remarks, we think the lack of reference to the proposed directive is a missed opportunity to make all this easier, but there are still ways to be able to enforce human rights due diligence obligations in public procurement in line with the Public Procurement Directive. We very much look forward to your questions and any discussion that these might have. And I'm sure Peter will give you more explanation of how this is actually done in practice. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura. And yes, I'm going to like to hand over now to Peter from Electronics Watch, who's going to give the viewpoint of civil society on this increased regulation. Over to you, Peter.
Yes, hi, thank you. Same for me. Thank you for the invite. It's really great to speak in this great round here. My name is Peter Pawlicki. I work with Electronics Watch. I'm located in Berlin, and I've been studying the electronics industry for the last 20 years, mostly as a sociologist, but now I'm in public procurement, so that's also a career you can have. Well, what I wanted to talk about are basically 4 comments or 4 points, and then talk a bit about Electronics Watch as an organization, what we do. And the 4 points are basically a reflection of what I see is happening with public buyers that we work with, we work on electronics, on ICT procurement. I think the central piece that I see is that due diligence, sustainability, all these concepts, all these new ideas are being brought to public procurement. And public procurers, basically, that's very new for them. That's not an issue that they have been either trained for or that they have been working in the last decade. So it is really a challenging task very often for a public buyer to wrap their heads around, why should I be doing that? How is this relating to my expertise of really being able to manage a procurement and a tender? And how do I go about it? So they need expertise. They need to know about all these human rights and due diligence processes and sustainability. They need to know about process. This needs to change. They need to move much more into dialogue. And it's also about what you focus on. Do you focus on tendering, or do you focus rather, for example, on contract management? What is your organization really moving on? So that's a big challenge. And the second point kind of relates to this that I want to make. It's the discussion is very strongly focused on regulation. I'm very often asked on panels, so Peter, what kind of better regulation would we need? And my standard answer for the last 2-3 years was like, we don't need no regulation. We basically need to have, sorry, my phone is doing something strange. We don't need new regulation. We basically need more capacities with public buyers. We need to support them. We need to provide leadership with public buyers. We need to provide, so leadership means really, I don't know what is happening. Sorry. This is really annoying. Okay. We need to, they're basically leaders need to really advise public buyers that that's the strategic goal, that sustainability is a way how to enforce or how to implement specific strategic goals. Public buyers need resources, so basically time, money, space, expertise, and they need training. They need basically to understand where this is going, how this is going to be implemented. And they need, public procurement is changing really strongly. This we know this from kind of procurement of or purchasing departments from private companies, but working with the supply chain, really looking at your supply chain not as something that will go away within once the contract is gone, but really as a as the process that delivers the product or the service you are actually procuring, and really working with your suppliers to develop them towards the goal you want to see. So not assuming that they will deliver to you fair or sustainably produced ICT or chocolate or whatever service you would want to have, but understanding the complexities of the supply chain and really understanding also that by working with your suppliers, you can move with them along the way, a process perspective to really improve what they can deliver and what they are delivering. And that's really great with public procurement because you have long contracts. You have contracts that go from 3 to 7 to 8 years sometimes. So you actually have a time to work with your supplier and to improve them. But that means very strong focus on contract management and also resources there. And this is this was really interesting what Laura said. So it is a challenge because you have a challenge with contract performance conditions. You basically have to focus on the subject matter of the contract here. But you can turn this around and say, okay, because I have to do this, this is regulated. I need supply chain transparency. And supply chain transparency means I need locations, not tier 1, not tier 2, but tier 3, 4, everything. As a supplier, as a public procurer, you actually can push very strongly for supply chain transparency because you need to, because you're regulated to do that, but also because this is actually helping every civil society organization and also the affected workers and communities there. Why do you need supply chain transparency beyond the turnaround regulation? If you know where your factories are, you can ask questions and develop your suppliers in a different way, and you will go beyond the CSR glitz. If you ask a company about what are you doing in sustainability, they will flip out their newest CSR presentation. It will look really nice. It will be super nice, and they are basically helping the world to become a much better place. Once you start asking about specific factories, about what is going on there and there, they will become guarded, and they will need to learn that you will really want to know what is happening. So that's basically why supply chain transparency is also important. Now, for the last, I think, 2 or 3 minutes I have, what is electronic storage? Electronic storage is basically doing what I was just talking about. We provide the expertise to our members who are public buyers, so they can really understand what is happening in their supply chain. So we establish supply chain transparency. We help them to establish supply chain transparency. We monitor the specific factories in their supply chains. We look at violations of human rights, of labor rights. And then we also manage the remediation process. So really going to the brands, going to the manufacturers, and really moving towards an improvement. Again, based on the idea, things are not good. Things won't be perfect in 2 years, but we can improve it step by step. That's what Electronics Watch has been doing for the last 5 years now, 6 years. Now we have a membership of more than 900 organizations, especially in the UK with universities. So we are probably at a university that is an Electronics Watch member, which is really, really great. On our website, you can look at what countries we are in. We are in Europe, but also in Australia. This is a rather very successful model. Successful meaning we actually can help workers on a sustainable basis. So workers in the supply chains of our members have a better working condition. All workers, definitely not, because it's hundreds of thousands of factories, but quite a big number, not a big share, but quite a big number. And because we have been quite successful with this in relation to ICT procurement, we thought, okay, what is about cars? What can we do cars? And cars are nothing more, especially if you look at electric vehicles, are nothing more than driving computers. You have batteries and you have a lot of chips and a lot of computers. So these are kind of two supply chains that overlap very strongly with the ICT supply chain. And so this year we also started to look into vehicles. And this is actually even more successful from an interest perspective, because a lot of public buyers are procuring vehicles, be it buses, be it utility vehicles or standard personnel vehicles. And because of the EU Clean Vehicle Directive, they are mandated to procure increasing share of electric vehicles. And so the interest in human rights due diligence is also there. So we hope that in some years' time, we will be really able to at least improve the working conditions within these supply chains. Just as a last statement, I think public procurement is a real great and impactful tool to move corporations towards doing better. It just takes a lot of work, a lot of time, and don't expect any changes soon.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Peter. Well, we've got 20 minutes, well, about 15 minutes left for discussion. So if I can ask if anybody would like to raise a Zoom hand and ask our panel members a question, or even feel free to put it in the chat. I see some of the panel members have already started to answer some of the questions in the chat, which is great. But if anybody would like to come off mute and ask a question, please do so. I suppose maybe I'll throw one question out there while people are thinking, and I suppose it's that idea of that capacity building, and I'm just intrigued as to whether or not maybe sometimes public procurers have to get in more specialist teams. I'm just thinking of this potentially the specialist knowledge that is required to drill down into this information, and I suppose adding it on to an already, I suppose, ever increasing workload for public procurers. And I'm just curious as to whether some public bodies maybe have that function sitting elsewhere, because also just conscious that by the time it gets to procurement, presumably that's too late. You almost need to be thinking about it at business case stage, especially if it has cost implications and implications on your time frame. So that's what's one sort of comment or question that I'll throw out there. Caroline, I can see that you have your hand raised. If we'll take your question, please.
Sure, thank you. I think this is really interesting, and one of the comments that Peter made just at the end of his presentation, actually, I'd just like to follow up on. And he said this takes a lot of time and resources. And most public procurement officials that I know are rather short of both. And I'm just wondering how much pushback you're getting, because they just say, look, we'd love to do this, but it has to go on the wish list because we have so many other things that we absolutely have to do. And I know if they're regulated, you can sort of do the tick box thing and it looks like you're doing the right thing. How's this playing out? Is it improving in your conversations with them?
I think so. I've been working with Electronic Watch for the last 4 years, I think now. I'm really bad with the pandemic made me bad with time. It's improving considerably. So I mostly the case of Germany was a really interesting one. When I started off, I had discussions with procurers who would ask me, so what's my value in this if I become a member of the Electronic Watch? That's basically cost. What do I get out of it? And it's basically, you don't get anything out of it. It's only cost. Because what do you get out of improving sustainability in your supply chain? Well, you can make material arguments about whatever you want to do, but in the end, the product you will have on your desk or the product you will deliver to your colleague on the desk won't be different a lot. Currently, after 4 years of work, and especially due to the supply chain law, the German one, which is maybe not the best one, but still, it changed the discourse for public buyers. Although they don't fall under it mostly, they have understood that there is a need and and the need is being regulated. So it really changed. And I think the dynamic is growing for the interest as well as for the need to invest in that. And I think that's really the leadership question that we would need to talk about.
Lena, I can see you have your hand up. I'm just conscious if anybody has any more questions before we maybe address that. And maybe, Lena, if you wouldn't mind kind of responding and then give people time to pop some questions in.
Yeah, for sure. I know I keep it really brief. I just had 2 thoughts that were popping up while I was hearing Peter and then also Carolyn's comments. One thing that came through in what Peter was just saying and that I didn't really touch on when I presented this, but there's obviously then also from a regulator perspective, this whole issue of walking the talk, right? So let's say the German government adopts the supply chain law and the German government is also a purchaser. How does it go together if then we have big scandals related to the supply chain? We've seen that around COVID. Many of you might know this example of the gloves that were purchased in the Nordics that later turned out to be associated with bonded labor in Malaysia. And I think that is the kind of stuff that then convinces a lot of people, okay, not only are we linked to this, but also we can do something about it as public buyers. And then there is this kind of double-faced responsibility, I think, as well. On the one hand, there are laws about this, but then also is a moral obligation to it. And then I think that brings us then also to this point that Carolyn was asking about and that you made as well, Andrea, about capacity. I think there is a certain leadership needed to be able to invest in the institutional aspects. This is a little bit what I pointed out with this element of due diligence taking place at the portfolio level. And that is something that we see, for example, in Sweden, where they've grouped together this function of risk management at the portfolio level, looking at what are we buying in a group of public buyers and which of these products are the ones that are riskier and therefore require more attention. We can't solve everything. We can't have 100% clean supply chain, similar to what Peter was saying. But I think the magic here is in this prioritization element. So being aware, what is the risk that we're exposed to? And then as a second step, prioritizing the elements that public buyers can address. And that, I totally agree, is a matter of having the knowledge, the skill, and also the institutional and professional capacity to do so. But that's also reflected, by the way, in the due diligence guidance of the OECD. So the risk management function is one of the 6 steps that I presented earlier.
Brilliant, thank you. Anne, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out another question for our panelists to address. This is obviously a very complex area in terms of the different kinds of environmental considerations, human rights, labor rights you might be wanting to address through these mechanisms. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how they might be focused on a sort of manageable set of considerations. It can sometimes feel a little bit vague. looking in at it from the outside, these are all good things, but in fact, if you spend time, each one of them is highly complex and has many different facets. So I'd love to know a bit more about maybe selecting particular rights or considerations to focus on or prioritizing between them.
Brilliant, thanks, Anne. And there's also come up in the chat as well. I know we've talked a bit about SMEs and not being included, but potentially for the increased regulation to disincentivize smaller types of organizations from bidding. So that might be something else that panel members want to address. So we'll maybe go round, actually, the panel members just in the same order. If you want to kind of pick up on one or maybe both of those questions. So if we can pick up with Lena again.
Yes, let me start with this question of the complexity of the considerations and then maybe selecting particular rights. I mean, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises don't give a priority to these different aspects for a reason, but I think what we see in practice, people are or organizations are doing that. So there are examples actually from the pilot that I mentioned earlier where let's say due to the analysis of the portfolio, where first of all the public buyer saw that there are certain issues associated, for example, with labor rights, they decided to focus on that, and then that also, for example, in Switzerland, linked very nicely to some of the priorities that the government as a whole had. And so for them, they started with the question, do workers in public supply chains earn a decent wage? So if the uniforms of the Swiss Post are being produced, are the workers earning decent wages? And that's where they started. I think that might be an approach. I think it really depends on the product. It depends on prioritization. I think on the portfolio level, also how you have leverage as a public buyer to address some of these issues. So prioritization is really key here. And it's in a similar way, you could also apply that to the question of smaller businesses that can also prioritize to an extent. Obviously, they might not have the same leverage, but they might have some leverage, and maybe supply chain transparency, as Peter was pointing out, might be also one of the key elements that we can draw on to at least take first steps. So as I said, we won't reach from today to tomorrow as 100% clean supply chain with 100% fair wages and workers and working conditions. But I think taking the first steps and doing so where you have leverage and where the greatest harm is done, I think that's very important.
I can go on for the question in the chat about SMEs. So the reason why SMEs are excluded from the scope of the directive is that, as Laura said, conducting supply chain due diligence is very extensive and very, it causes a big economic burden for small companies. That is why, even though it's a fragmentation of the internal market, they are not burdened with carrying out these tasks. However, as you said, and I completely agree with this is a disincentive for them if a public buyer were to request supply chain due diligence. Because if a public buyer requests this wouldn't be a problem of if you're a big company and if you have a turnover, how many employees do you have? But it will request it because it wants to ensure that its own supply chain is clear. So I think the answer to this question will depend on the final text of the proposal and the transposing national acts that will be adopted once the proposal is accepted.
Brilliant, thank you. And Laura, do you have anything to add to those two questions, or if not, we'll hand over to Peter?
I just think it's quite different to say we will enforce the law or we would enforce requirements that go beyond the law. So if we have the proposal, we have obliged companies that would have to conduct human rights due diligence in which SMEs are excluded. So enforcing the law will not be requesting human rights due diligence for SMEs because they are excluded. That such requirement would be going beyond the law, and that is way more problematic than enforcing an existing union law. But I would just totally agree with Ezgi's answer.
Thank you. And Peter, would you like to pick up on one or even both of those issues from what you're seeing in Electronics Watch?
Yeah, I can't talk a lot about SMEs because ICT is basically not SMEs. It's just, I mean, even the resellers are huge companies. But the question on where to start, I always tell any potential affiliate or not any public buyer, just start. You will fail and you will basically do things wrong, and then you will learn. Even guys like APUC, if you really want to see a really well-developed system of public procurement, go to APUC's website. It's fascinating. They have been doing it for the last, I think, 12 or 15 years. They learned, they developed, they instituted a reflective system of, we want to go there. We don't know how we will get there, but we will learn from our failures and successes. You can do it very, very, very well organized, like the OSCE has done it. They have basically said, okay, we want to do that. We go to a university and they will look at our supply chain and they will tell us what we should be doing. And they went to Nottingham, I think, and they did a real interesting supply chain research on their supply chains, which is also possible. And then the colleagues at OEC, they started by basically developing a guideline for an internal guideline, and I think it's now released publicly. So you can also go in a very organized and systematic way. The thing is, if you don't start, you can't go anywhere. It is a daunting task, absolutely, but just start with small things. And there is a lot that has been already done, so you don't have to develop anything new. Just look through the literature that the European Union has, for example, published, or Procura Plus has been publishing, or ICLEI has been publishing. They have a lot of tools for any sector you can imagine as public buyers. Just go there and copy paste stuff. Or go to European Union, the green, the public, how do you call it, the green public procurement guidelines. Absolutely brilliant documents. Almost nobody is using them because they're really complex, and you can just lose a day of reading them. I would always just say start.
Fantastic, thank you. Conscious that we are nearing to a close, and if nobody else has any other questions, I want to thank, before I hand back to Anne, I want to thank all of the panel members. Hopefully you'll agree that was a really interesting session, and I think a lot of common themes still coming through across the other sessions that we've had, particularly in and around capacity building. There are I see a lot of trends with this topic and broader social value, and sort of operationally some of the challenges that we see, particularly around that limitation in relation to subject matter of the contract. So I think that's very interesting. Laura, your comment about, if it's going to be uniforms, then it's uniforms on that particular contract as opposed to uniforms across the company. And I suppose sort of underlying, yes, there's increased regulation of this area, but the vagueness of it and the kind of sort of difficulty in how to work out how it actually applies to public procurement maybe raises certain questions of, will public procurers actually go ahead and do it if they're not mandated to do it, or if there's not a kind of clear direction. But I suppose that comes back to your point, Peter, of just start. There are resources out there. There are organisations that are doing it very well, and you've referred to APOC. So hopefully that's something that I will certainly be looking at from a NI perspective. So thank you to all our panel members. Thank you to everyone who's dialed in today. I hope everyone found that useful, and I'd like to hand back to Anne.
Fantastic, and thank you to Andrea for helping to put this session together, and for chairing it so expertly. I see Rory's got a hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to say that shortly we will be sending out a survey, an end of year POGO survey, at some point early December, and I encourage you all to respond. We're trying to get better at planning the rest of the year, so I'll give you a sense of what's going on. Your feedback is very welcome. This is a very open group. I encourage you to share participation in the group, and thanks for everybody today.
And so I'm right in thinking that we have our next session in January. Last Tuesday in December might be a time when we've got other things to do of a holiday kind. So hopefully we'll see you all in January. Those of you who want to stick around and have a more informal conversation with our speakers without the recording on, please do stay. They've kindly offered to stay, and you're very welcome to stick around. Otherwise, we'll see the rest of you in January, and the recording of this session will be available on the website in due course. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in today.